Sam had never thought he would find himself in the middle of nowhere, stranded on a planet so far from Earth, his home. One moment, he was in a ship, traveling through the stars on a routine space exploration mission. And the next, he was tumbling through the sky in what remained of the spacecraft. The crash was sudden, a jarring, violent moment that felt like his body was being torn apart by the force of the impact. He could barely remember the chaos. Lights flashing, alarms blaring, and his body flung in every direction as the ship fell apart around him. Everything happened so fast. When the world finally stopped spinning, Sam woke up with a headache that felt like 1,000 hammers pounding inside his skull. He blinked against the harsh light of the alien sun and tried to focus. His vision was blurry, and his body felt heavy, like it was made of stone. It took a few moments for his mind to catch up with what was happening. He was on a planet, a strange, alien world, with no one else around. The wreckage of his ship was scattered across the rocky landscape. The pieces of metal and broken machinery that used to be his home lay half-buried in the dirt, sizzling faintly as smoke rose from the damage. Sam was alive, but he had no idea how. His head throbbed, and his body ached with every movement, but he had no choice but to get up and move. He had to survive. Sam pushed himself up, gritting his teeth against the pain. He needed to assess the situation. There was no one around. No crew, no rescue, just the vast, empty horizon stretching before him, filled with strange mountains and a sky that seemed different. The color of the clouds was darker, the air smelled unfamiliar, and the strange trees in the distance looked nothing like anything he had ever seen on Earth. He limped over to the wreckage, trying to gather anything useful, but the damage was extensive. The ship's communication systems were destroyed, and all he had left was a small emergency kit that had somehow survived the crash. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the next few hours, Sam did what he could to make himself comfortable. He used parts of the ship to build a small shelter, gathering scraps of metal to shield himself from the harsh rays of the alien sun. As he worked, his thoughts wandered. Was anyone looking for him? Did anyone even know he was here? How far from Earth was he? Just as he began to feel the weight of the loneliness pressing down on him, he saw movement in the distance. A figure, a tall, slender being with shimmering skin that seemed to glow faintly in the sunlight. Sam's heart skipped a beat. Could this be a rescue party? But as the figure came closer, Sam froze. The alien woman moved with an almost eerie grace, her long dark hair floating lightly in the air as if she was underwater. Her eyes were large and bright, like two glowing orbs, but her expression was one of worry, not hope. When she reached Sam, she stopped a few feet away, studying him carefully. Sam could feel the weight of her gaze, and he instinctively took a step back. He didn't know if this alien was friend or foe. The woman didn't speak at first. She just watched him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read. Curiosity, maybe, or pity. "I can help you," she finally said, her voice surprisingly soft, yet with an alien quality to it that made Sam's skin crawl. Sam tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and it took him a moment to find his voice. Who are you?" "I am Mira," she replied. "I've been tracking your ship. I didn't mean for you to crash. It's my fault. But I can help you." Mira's words didn't bring the relief Sam had expected. Instead, they left him with more questions than answers. "You're saying you caused this?" Sam asked, his voice rising in disbelief. She nodded, her expression solemn. "Not directly. But I had been observing your ship. When something went wrong, I couldn't stop it in time." Sam studied her for a moment. She didn't seem to be lying. But what kind of alien would let something like this happen? He felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. This wasn't the time for questions. He was still alive, and this woman might be his only chance of survival. "What now?" he asked, trying to focus. "I can help you get back to your people," Nira said, her eyes glimmering. But you need to come with me. We need to move quickly." Sam hesitated. Could he trust her? Everything about the situation felt wrong, but at the same time, Nira seemed to be the only chance he had to survive. He didn't know what to do, but the growing pain in his body, the burning hunger in his stomach, and the cold weight of loneliness pushing at him made the decision easier. "All right," Sam said finally, looking around one last time at the wreckage of his ship. He was leaving it behind, for now, and following Nira into the unknown. "Lead the way." Nira turned without another word, moving swiftly through the rocky terrain. Sam followed, trying to keep up despite the aches in his body. As they walked, he glanced over at her. She wasn't looking back at him, but something in her posture, in the way her shoulders were tense, told him she wasn't entirely at ease either. They walked in silence for a long time, the alien world stretching endlessly around them. There were strange, haunting noises in the distance, things that Sam couldn't identify, and the landscape only seemed to grow more unfamiliar the further they went. The air felt colder now, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. As Sam trudged on, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping over him. The alien woman had saved him, for now. But what did she really want? And what kind of planet had he ended up on? Sam followed Nira across the strange alien landscape, his legs sore from the effort. Despite her earlier promise to help him, she said little as they moved through the rocky terrain. He could only focus on keeping his pace steady, taking in the bizarre surroundings. The trees they passed looked like twisted, metallic branches, and the sky above them had turned from a bright orange to a deep purple. It was unlike anything Sam had ever seen on Earth. The air was thin, making every breath feel heavier than it should. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the only sounds the crunch of their feet against the ground and the occasional hum of distant machinery. Sam's mind kept racing. He still didn't trust Nira completely. She had left him to die on that planet after the crash, and now she was acting like nothing had happened. But she had helped him survive so far, and he couldn't ignore that. He wanted answers. He needed to know why she had abandoned him and what her real intentions were. Finally, after a long stretch of walking, Nira stopped near a rocky outcrop. Sam barely managed to keep his balance as he approached her. His legs were aching from the long trek, and he was starting to feel dizzy. He hoped she would at least let him rest for a moment. "We need to move quickly," Nira said, her voice steady, but there was an urgency in it that Sam hadn't noticed before. She seemed to be looking around nervously. "This is not a safe place for us to linger." Sam raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? What's going on? I thought you were going to help me." "I will," she said, her gaze flickering to the sky. "But you have to understand. There are dangers here that you don't know about." Sam frowned. "Dangers? What kind of dangers?" Nira hesitated before responding. "My people, our kind, don't always play by the same rules you do. This planet isn't just an ordinary place. It's part of something much larger than you can understand." Sam's confusion deepened. What does that even mean? Before she could answer, a loud low hum echoed through the air, followed by a strange, buzzing sound. Sam looked around, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing in sight. His heart began to race. Nira seemed unfazed, but Sam couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled over him. Nira motioned for him to follow her quickly. "We need to move," she said, urgency in her voice now. "They're coming." Sam didn't ask who they were. He just followed, his curiosity now mixed with fear. The strange buzzing grew louder, and the air seemed to grow even colder. Every step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to hold him back. Nira's pace quickened, and Sam struggled to keep up with her. They crossed more rocky outcrops and uneven ground, but Sam didn't dare stop to rest. The sound was getting closer, and he could feel the tension rising in the air. It wasn't just the strange noises anymore. It was something more, something deep in his gut telling him they were being watched. Eventually, Nira led him to a narrow passage between two jagged cliffs. It was dark here, the sky above completely blocked by the high rock walls. Sam could barely see where they were going, but Nira seemed to know the way, moving quickly through the darkness. "We'll be safe here," Nira said, her voice a little calmer now. For a while, Sam leaned against the rough stone wall, panting heavily. His body was sore from the walk, and his stomach was gnawing at him. He hadn't eaten in hours. "What was that noise?" he asked, trying to catch his breath. Nira didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes scanning the passage, watching for any signs of movement. Finally, she spoke. "Those were the hunters," she said quietly. "They are a part of my people's experiments. They don't understand what it means to be human, to survive." She looked at Sam, her eyes filled with something like regret. "They are not friendly. They don't show mercy." Sam's mind was spinning. Hunters, experiments. What are you talking about? "I'll explain later," Nira said quickly, her voice tight. "Right now, we need to stay hidden. If we're spotted, there won't be a way to escape." Sam could hardly believe what he was hearing. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened since the crash. But as he looked at Nira, something told him she wasn't lying. The urgency in her voice, the fear in her eyes. He couldn't ignore it. He nodded, although he still didn't understand everything. "So, what do we do now?" he asked. Nira took a deep breath, her expression softening just slightly. "We wait. We don't have much time, but if we're lucky, the hunters will pass by." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant echo of the buzzing noise that was now barely audible. Sam could feel his muscles starting to stiffen from the long walk, and his stomach growled again. He had to eat something soon. "I don't mean to rush you," Sam said quietly, trying to break the silence. "But I haven't had anything to eat in hours. Do you have any food or supplies?" Nira glanced over at him. "You're hungry," she said, more to herself than to him. "I didn't think to bring anything. I wasn't planning on anyone needing food, but there is a small cache nearby. If we're careful, we can get there." Sam didn't want to press her further, but he couldn't ignore the growing hunger. He was exhausted, thirsty, and starving. He had to get something soon, or he wouldn't make it much longer. Nira stood up, glancing over her shoulder. "We'll leave once I'm sure the hunters have passed. Stay close, and don't make a sound." Sam nodded. He knew now wasn't the time to ask more questions. They would need to survive first, and everything else could wait. He just hoped that when he got answers, they would make sense. The hours passed in uneasy silence as Sam and Nira waited in the narrow passage. Sam couldn't help but feel the weight of the stillness pressing down on him. The alien world around them felt strangely alive, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His body ached from the long walk, and hunger gnawed at him, but Nira's warnings kept him on edge. The hunters were out there somewhere, and the thought of being spotted made him shiver more than the cold air ever could. As the minutes dragged on, Sam tried to focus on his thoughts, but they kept returning to one question. What exactly had he gotten himself into? He glanced over at Nira. She was standing still, her eyes scanning the landscape outside the narrow crevice they were hiding in. Her posture was tense, alert. She was clearly more comfortable in this environment than he was, but it only made him more nervous. She was calm, but Sam could see that her mind was racing. "How much longer?" Sam asked, trying to break the silence. His voice was hoarse from the lack of water, and the hunger in his stomach felt like a heavy weight. Nira didn't answer immediately. She was still watching the horizon, her sharp gaze piercing the distance. Finally, she turned to him, her expression serious. "We can't wait much longer. The hunters are unpredictable, and they could come this way at any time." Sam nodded, knowing she was right. "So what's the plan? You said something about a cache." Nira hesitated before speaking. "Yes, a small supply station. It's not far from here, But we need to move quickly. I don't know how much time we have." Sam swallowed, his mouth dry. He was exhausted, but the thought of food and water pushed him forward. "Lead the way." Nera didn't hesitate. She stepped out from their hiding place and signaled for Sam to follow. They moved quietly, slipping between rocks and under low-hanging branches, careful to stay hidden from view. The landscape seemed to stretch on forever, and Sam's senses were on high alert, his every step measured and deliberate. They traveled for what felt like an hour, the world around them eerily quiet. The buzzing sound had faded, and for a moment, Sam dared to believe they might have escaped the hunters. But his optimism was short-lived. Nera's eyes never stopped scanning, and she moved with purpose, leading him down paths that seemed to appear out of nowhere. As they crested a hill, Sam spotted a structure in the distance. It looked like a small building, half buried in the ground, with strange markings on the surface. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something that could help him stay alive a little longer. "Is that it?" Sam asked, pointing toward the building. Nera nodded. "Yes, that's the supply station. But it's not just a place for food and water. It's also a communication relay. I'll be able to contact my people and get help." Sam's heart skipped a beat. "You're going to call for help?" Nera glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Not for you. For me." Sam's chest tightened. He had known from the beginning that Nera was an alien, but her words still stung. "So, you're not going to help me get back to Earth?" Nera's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I can't. My people are watching you. And if I help you, they will consider me a traitor." Sam stared at her, his mind racing. "Then why help me at all? Why not just leave me to die like you did before?" Nera's face hardened, and for the first time since he had met her, Sam saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes. "Guilt. I didn't leave you because I wanted to," she said quietly. "I left because it was what I had to do. You wouldn't understand." Sam didn't respond. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but there was something about her voice, something in the way she spoke, that made him hold back. He didn't know what had happened to her, but he could sense the weight of her words. There was more to this story than he understood. They'd reached the supply station, and Nera quickly approached the entrance. It was an odd structure, covered in strange symbols and markings. It didn't look like anything Sam had ever seen, not even in the sci-fi books he'd read as a child. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and they entered. The inside of the building was dimly lit, and Sam's eyes had to adjust to the low light. It was a small room, filled with strange devices and equipment. A few storage containers were stacked against the walls, and there was a terminal in the center of the room. Nera moved quickly to the terminal, typing something into the strange alien keyboard. Sam stood by the door, still trying to wrap his mind around everything. His stomach rumbled loudly, but he didn't dare ask Nera for food. He didn't want to seem weak, especially after everything that had happened. After a few moments, Nera's fingers paused over the keys, and she stared at the screen, her expression tense. Sam couldn't see the display, but he could tell that something wasn't right. "What's going on?" Sam asked, stepping closer. Nera didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were locked on the terminal, her fingers trembling slightly. I can't get through," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The signal is blocked. Someone's interfering with it." Sam frowned. Interfering? Who could be blocking the signal on this planet? Nera's face darkened. "Someone who doesn't want you to leave. Someone who has been watching us both." Sam's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly felt the weight of their situation more than ever. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. Whatever game Mira was playing, whatever mission she was on, it was far more complicated than he had understood. "We need to move," Nera said, her voice sharper now. "There's no time. We're not alone here." Sam swallowed hard, the realization sinking in. There was no easy escape from this world. Not yet. But one thing was clear. Nira wasn't the only one who had secrets. And now, Sam had to find a way to survive, to navigate this dangerous game with no idea who he could trust. The room inside the supply station felt smaller now, more suffocating, as Sam processed Nira's words. Someone was blocking their signal. Someone didn't want them to leave the planet. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. His heart was racing, and his thoughts were spinning. Nira was still standing by the terminal, her face pale and tense. Her fingers hovered over the alien keyboard, her eyes flickering from the screen to the door. Sam stood frozen, not sure what to do. Should he trust her? Should he keep asking questions, or should he simply go along with whatever she planned? Who's blocking the signal? Sam asked quietly, his voice shaky. He could hear the fear creeping into his own words, but he didn't care. He was scared. Everything was happening so fast, and he had no control over it. Nira didn't answer right away. Instead, she tapped a few more keys on the terminal. The screen flashed with static. Then a strange symbol appeared, something that looked like a twisted circle with lines radiating outward. Sam had never seen anything like it. He had no idea what it meant, but it was clear from Nira's expression that this was bad news. "It's them," she said, her voice barely audible. "The ones who created the hunters. The ones who are keeping you here." Sam's stomach churned. His mind was racing again. He'd thought this was just a random crash. He thought he'd end up back home. Somehow. Earth, his family, everything familiar. But now it was clear this planet wasn't just an accident. This place was a trap, and he had no idea who was behind it. "How do we stop them?" Sam asked, stepping closer to the terminal, his eyes glued to the flashing symbols on the screen. "How do we get out of here?" Nira shook her head. "It's not that simple. If they find us, they won't let us leave. They'll..." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the station. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of something, or someone, coming closer. Nira's eyes widened in alarm, and she immediately stepped away from the terminal, her face tightening. "They're here," she whispered, her voice cold. "They found us." Sam's pulse quickened. He had no idea what kind of people or creatures these were, but if they were anything like the hunters she'd mentioned, they were not something he wanted to face. He turned to Nira. "What do we do? We need to leave now." Nira didn't move. She was frozen in place, her eyes fixed on the door, her body tense. She was waiting for something, but Sam didn't know what. "We can't leave just yet," Nira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to buy us some time." Before Sam could ask what she meant, Nira moved toward a large crate in the corner of the room. She crouched down and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small device that looked like a handheld communicator, but more advanced. It was unlike anything Sam had ever seen. The device glowed faintly in Nira's hands as she adjusted it, her face focused. "What is that?" Sam asked, watching her closely. "It's a jammer," Nira explained. "It will block their tracking devices for a while. It won't last long, but it's our best chance." Sam didn't fully understand how it worked, but he didn't have time to ask more questions. The footsteps were getting closer. "How long do we have?" "A few minutes," Nira said, her voice tight. She placed the jammer on the floor, her fingers hovering over the buttons. "I have to activate it now." Nira pressed a series of buttons, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft hum filled the room. The screen on the terminal flickered again, the strange symbol from earlier vanishing. Sam's heart skipped a beat. Was it working? For a brief moment, everything seemed calm. But then, a loud bang sounded from the door. Someone, or something, was trying to get inside. Nira's eyes darted to the door, then back to Sam. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice low. "We need to move now." Before Sam could react, Nira grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the back of the room. They passed more strange equipment, and Sam tried not to look at any of it. The technology here was unlike anything he could have imagined. They reached a small, narrow corridor in the back of the building. Sam could feel his heart pounding in his chest as Nira led him through it. The corridor twisted and turned, and Sam lost track of which way they were heading. It felt like they were just running blindly, but Nira seemed to know exactly where she was going. She wasn't panicked. She was focused. They reached a small hatch at the end of the corridor. Nira placed her hand on a sensor near the door, and it hissed open. On the other side was a dark passageway that led into the unknown. Sam didn't hesitate. He followed Nira without a second thought, trusting her to lead the way. But just as they stepped through the door, Sam heard the sound of shouting. The door to the supply station had been breached. The hunters, or whoever had been following them, were close. "We have to hurry," Nira urged, her voice sharp. "This way." They moved quickly, the air growing colder as they descended deeper into the passage. Sam felt his legs aching from the strain of running, but he kept moving. There was no choice now. There was only survival. The passage seemed endless, winding through tunnels and chambers that Sam couldn't make sense of. Every step brought him deeper into the unknown, and with each passing moment, he could feel the tension building in his chest. What was waiting for them down here? What were they running from? Nira didn't slow down. Her eyes were focused straight ahead, her face a mask of determination. Sam couldn't read her. He didn't know if he should trust her, but at that moment, he had no other choice. He wasn't sure how long they ran. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that something was just ahead. Something important. Something that might be their way out, or their doom. Finally, they reached a large cavern. It was dimly lit by a faint blue glow coming from deep within the cavern's walls. In the center of the cavern was an enormous machine, its purpose unclear, but it looked powerful, too powerful to be something Sam could ignore. Nira stopped at the entrance to the cavern and turned to Sam. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "The final choice. We either go forward, or we face what's coming. Are you ready?" Sam didn't have an answer, but deep down, he knew they had no other choice. The only way out was to move forward. The cavern felt vast, its walls stretching into darkness. The blue glow illuminated the surroundings in a soft, eerie light, casting long shadows that seemed to dance across the floor. Sam and Nira stood at the entrance, facing the massive machine in the center of the space. It looked like some kind of generator, or perhaps a weapon, with wires and tubes running all over its surface. Whatever it was, Sam could tell it wasn't meant to be here, hidden beneath the surface of the planet. Nira stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the machine. Her face was tense, and her hands were trembling ever so slightly. Sam couldn't help but wonder what kind of secrets she was keeping. This machine, this cavern, it was all part of something bigger, something Sam didn't understand yet. "This is it?" Sam asked, his voice echoing in the cavern. He looked around, the weight of the situation settling heavily on him. The machine seemed out of place, like a dark heart buried in the ground. It felt wrong, like everything else on this planet. Nira nodded but didn't speak right away. Instead, she walked up to the machine, examining it closely. Her fingers brushed the surface, tracing over symbols and markings Sam couldn't recognize. She seemed focused, as if trying to remember something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "This is the core," she said softly, almost to herself. "It controls everything. It's why we're stuck here." Sam took a step closer. "The core. What does it do? What do you mean by stuck here?" Nira turned to him, her eyes meeting his. For the first time since they had met, Sam saw vulnerability in her gaze. There was something deep behind her eyes, something she had been hiding. "The people who created this planet, my people, they built it as a trap, not just for humans, but for anyone who tries to escape. This core keeps us all here, locked in." Sam blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "You mean, this whole planet is a prison?" Nira nodded. Yes, it was built as a containment world, a place where we could study, observe, without interference. But the core doesn't just trap people physically. It traps them mentally too. It changes how we think, how we act. I didn't realize it at first, but now I see it clearly. Sam's mind raced. He had no idea what Nira was saying. A prison. A place to study people. His world was upside down, and the pieces didn't seem to fit. He tried to focus, but the questions were piling up faster than he could process them. Wait, so you're saying you're not really in control, that this machine is making you? Nira's expression darkened. Yes, it's why I left you behind, why I did the things I did. The core messes with our instincts, our emotions. At first, it was subtle, but the longer we stay here, the harder it is to remember what's right. I almost forgot who I was. Sam took a step back, trying to make sense of everything she had said. His thoughts were swirling, the confusion overwhelming. But why help me now? Why did you come back for me? Nira hesitated, as if the question had caught her off guard. I don't know. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I know I've hurt you. I know I've made mistakes, but I couldn't leave you to die like that. I couldn't. Sam could hear the sincerity in her voice, but the words still didn't make sense. Nira was telling him things he didn't want to hear. He didn't want to believe that this whole planet was some kind of prison. And yet, deep down, a part of him felt it, like a shadow lurking in the back of his mind. So, if we destroy this core, it will free us? Sam asked, his voice shaking. He didn't know what else to do. Everything felt out of his control, and he needed a way to take back some of that power. Nira's eyes flashed with uncertainty. Destroying it? It's not that simple. The core is connected to everything on this planet. If we break it, we could set off a chain reaction. I'm not sure what will happen. Sam took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It felt like his life had become one big choice after another, and he had no idea if he was making the right ones. Should he trust Nira? Could he? And what about this planet? What was the truth behind it all? The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, a reminder that they weren't alone. Sam glanced over at Nira, his mind racing. They're coming, Nira said quietly, her voice tense. We have to make a decision now. Sam's heart pounded in his chest. There was no more time for thinking, no more time for second-guessing. He had to act. We'll do it, Sam said, his voice firm. We'll destroy the core. Whatever happens, we can't stay here. I want to go home. I want to get off this planet. Nira looked at him, her eyes filled with an unreadable expression. For a moment, it felt like she was measuring him, trying to gauge his determination. Finally, she nodded. All right, we'll do it together, but we have to be quick. Sam nodded in return. He didn't know how they were going to destroy the core, but he had no choice. He couldn't stay on this planet, not when everything he knew was a lie. Together, they moved toward the heart of the machine. Nira knelt beside it, inspecting the wires and control panels. Sam couldn't make sense of the alien technology, but he trusted Nira. She had to know what to do. All right, she said after a moment. I can override the system, but I need your help. You'll have to press this button when I tell you. Sam's hands were sweating, but he nodded. I'm ready. Nira gave him a small, almost reassuring smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. We can't turn back now. With a final deep breath, Nira began typing rapidly on the console, and Sam prepared himself for whatever came next. There was no going back. The moment they pressed that button, everything would change. Sam's heart raced as Nira typed faster on the terminal. The soft hum of the machine filled the cavern, echoing off the walls as if it were alive, aware of what was happening. Sam's eyes never left the large button on the console, the one that would trigger the core's destruction. His fingers twitched with anticipation. The moment he pressed it, There would be no turning back. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder, signaling that whoever was tracking them was getting closer. Sam felt the panic rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay focused. He couldn't afford to mess this up. Not now. Nara looked over at him, her face a mix of fear and determination. She was sweating, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. Sam nodded, though his stomach was in knots. "I'm ready." The footsteps outside were unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was coming for them. Sam could hear the faint, rhythmic thumping as they neared the entrance to the cavern. He glanced over his shoulder, but Nira quickly grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Focus, Sam," she said, her grip firm. "It's now or never." He forced himself to breathe. His mind flashed back to everything that had led him here. The crash, Nira's strange behavior, the hunters, and the growing realization that this planet wasn't just some random place. It was a prison, and the core was its key. Destroying it was their only chance for freedom. Nara's fingers danced across the keys again, and the screen in front of them flickered. A new countdown appeared, numbers flashing in red, ticking down with each passing second. "Only 30 seconds, Nara said, her voice tight. "Get ready." Sam's breath caught in his throat. 30 seconds. It didn't seem like enough time. The footsteps were almost at the door now, the sound growing louder with each passing moment. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his body, the fear threatening to overwhelm him. But he couldn't let it. Not now. He moved his hand toward the button on the console, his fingers hovering just above it. His mind raced, wondering what would happen once the core was destroyed. Would they be free? Would the planet collapse? He had no answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't be trapped anymore. Nara leaned over, her face close to his. "On my count," she whispered. 3, 2, 1. Press it." Without thinking, Sam slammed his hand down on the button. The cavern shook. For a split second, everything went still, as if time itself had paused. Then the sound of the machine's hum intensified, the lights on the walls flickering wildly. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he looked up at Nira, who was staring at the screen in shock. "What's happening?" Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper. The countdown on the screen had stopped. The numbers flashed wildly, then disappeared altogether. The machine gave one final, deafening hum before it went silent. Nira stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. It's not stopping," she muttered under her breath. "It's supposed to shut down. Why isn't it working?" Sam's stomach dropped. Had they made a mistake? Was this the end? He turned to look toward the entrance of the cavern, where the footsteps were now right outside. Whatever was coming wasn't far off, and if they couldn't stop the core from activating, they would be trapped. "Nira, what's going on?" Sam demanded, his voice urgent. "We need to go now." Nira didn't answer. She was still staring at the console, her hands trembling as she pressed more buttons. The machine groaned as if it were alive, struggling to stay on. Sam could see the panic rising in her eyes. She had known this would work, hadn't she? But why wasn't it working now? "Come on," Sam urged, stepping closer to her. "We can fix it later. We need to move." She snapped out of her trance, shaking her head. "No. If we don't shut it down properly, it could trigger something worse. I can't let that happen." The footsteps at the entrance grew louder, and Sam could feel his pulse quicken. There was no time left. "We don't have time for this," Sam shouted. "We need to run. Now." Nara hesitated, her fingers hovering over the controls. Then, with a deep breath, she turned away from the terminal. "Fine. We run. But we're not leaving until we figure this out." They didn't wait any longer. Nira grabbed Sam's arm again and pulled him toward a narrow tunnel that led deeper into the cavern. Sam followed without question, his legs moving on autopilot as they sprinted down the dark corridor. The sound of their footsteps echoed, but the sound of others was louder, closer. They didn't speak as they ran, their breath coming in short gasps as they navigated the twisting tunnels. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the dim blue light cast strange shadows that made Sam feel like they were being hunted. He had no idea where they were going or what would happen once they reached the end of the tunnel, but he knew one thing: they couldn't afford to stop. Behind them, the hunters were closing in. Sam could hear their voices now, harsh and alien, echoing through the cavern. They were getting closer. "We're almost there," Nira said, her voice strained. "Just a little further." Sam could feel the sweat pouring down his back, his heart pounding with every step. He could hear the hunters getting closer, their voices filling the tunnels like an oppressive force. Sam turned to look behind them, but there was nothing. Yet, the tunnel ahead began to open up into a larger chamber. The walls were lined with glowing crystals, casting an eerie light that flickered as if alive. In the center of the room stood a large, strange door, exactly the kind of door that Sam had hoped they'd find. It looked like the only way out. "Is this the exit?" Sam asked, his voice hopeful. Nira nodded, but there was a look of uncertainty in her eyes. "It should be." But before Sam could ask another question, the sound of footsteps rang out from behind them. The hunters had found them. "We don't have much time," Nira said urgently. "We need to get through that door now." Without waiting for a response, she pushed forward, her hands reaching for the control panel beside the door. Sam followed closely, his body tense, ready for whatever came next. The door hissed open, revealing a bright light on the other side. The bright light from the door flooded the room as Sam and Nira rushed forward, their footsteps echoing in the cavern. They barely had time to think as they passed through the doorway. The moment they stepped into the light, the heavy door hissed shut behind them, cutting off any sound from the hunters that had been chasing them. Sam's eyes squinted against the blinding brightness, his heart still pounding in his chest. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his body, making him dizzy. For a brief moment, he thought they were safe, but as the light began to fade and the surroundings took shape, he realized they had only stepped into something far stranger than he could have imagined. The room they entered was enormous, far larger than anything he'd seen before. The walls seemed to stretch infinitely upward, and the air was thick with a strange, almost metallic scent. Strange symbols and glowing markings covered every surface, casting a faint, eerie light throughout the space. There was no sign of the hunters. Nira, breathing heavily, let go of Sam's arm and stepped forward cautiously. "Where are we?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Nira replied, her eyes scanning the vast chamber. "I've never been here before." Sam's gaze darted around, his mind trying to make sense of the alien surroundings. This didn't look like any place on the planet they had seen before. There were no doors, no windows, just endless walls covered in symbols and glowing lines. It was like a hidden part of the planet, one that had been waiting for them to find it. They stood in silence for a long moment, the stillness pressing in on them. The air felt different here, almost electric, and Sam couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But by who? And why did this place seem so familiar, even though it clearly wasn't? "Do you feel that?" Sam asked, his voice low. Nira nodded without saying a word. She, too, had noticed the strange sensation, the subtle hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls and into their bones. It was like the whole room was alive. Suddenly, the floor beneath their feet shifted slightly, as if it were reacting to their presence. Sam instinctively stepped back, his hand reaching for Nira, who was already looking around, her face filled with awe and caution. "This place," she murmured, "it's not just a room. It's a command center." Sam's confusion deepened. Command center. What does that mean? Nira took a step forward, her eyes widening as she began to understand more of what she was seeing. "I think this is where everything started. This is where the core was controlled. This is where the hunters were created." Sam's mind raced. Everything he had been through, everything they had learned, was coming together. The core, the hunters, the prison planet. It all led to this moment. But what did it mean for them? How could they escape now? Before he could ask, a soft, mechanical whirring noise filled the room. Sam tensed, his eyes snapping toward the source. A large circular panel on one of the walls began to glow, its surface shifting as if it were made of liquid metal. Slowly, a holographic image flickered to life in front of them. The image was of a face, alien, but somehow familiar. It was Nura's face. Sam blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "Is that you?" he asked, his voice trembling. Nura stepped closer, her eyes wide with shock. "No, that's not me. Not exactly. It's a copy. A recording, I think." The image spoke, its voice mechanical, but clear. "Greetings, Nura," it said in a cold, emotionless tone. "You have arrived at the final stage of your journey. The time has come for you to make your choice." Nura's face grew pale, her expression unreadable as she watched the image. "A choice," she repeated. "What choice?" The hologram continued, its voice echoing through the room. "You have been given the power to choose. You can end this cycle, destroy the core, and free the people trapped on this planet. Or you can take control of the core, becoming its new guardian, and allow the cycle to continue. The choice is yours." Sam's mind whirled. This wasn't what he had expected. A choice. But what did it mean? What would happen if they destroyed the core? What would happen if they took control of it? Nura's eyes flickered with something like fear, then resolve. She stepped closer to the hologram, her voice shaking. "What happens if we destroy it?" A hologram didn't change its expression, but its answer came quickly. "The destruction of the core will release the inhabitants of this planet, allowing them to leave. However, it will also cause the collapse of the systems that have been holding this planet together. It will take time for the effects to be felt, but the damage will be irreversible." Sam's breath caught in his throat. This was bigger than he had imagined. If they destroyed the core, they could set everyone free, but they would be sacrificing everything in the process. "And if we take control?" Nura asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "The core will remain operational, but under your command. You will have the power to change the planet's future, but it will not come without its cost. The cycle will continue, and more will be trapped as you were. The decision is yours." For a long moment, neither Sam nor Nura spoke. They stood in silence, both of them processing the enormity of the decision before them. There was no easy answer. If they destroyed the core, they would set everyone free. But the planet would collapse, and they would have no way of knowing what would happen next. If they took control, they would be responsible for keeping the cycle going, trapping others in the same way they had been. Finally, Nira spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "We destroy it." Sam looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her decision. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the right one. They couldn't let this cycle continue. They had to stop it. Nira turned to Sam, her eyes filled with determination. "We end this now." Together, they moved toward the center of the room, where the core's control panel awaited them. It was time to make their fin.